things you need to worry about in terms of paying taxes if you live overseas. So now on to the main event of the day, and just to remind everyone that John will stay after the lunch today to do book signings. The book that he's written on Bo Xilai is on sale here, so you can come and get your book signed and chat to him after 2 o'clock today. Bo Xilai's fall and Xi Jinping's rise. How power really works in China. Well, John Gorneau has been covering China for, I think, about a decade. He's based in Beijing. He is the China correspondent for the sister publications The Age, the Sydney Morning Herald, and also a contributor to Foreign Policy. And it's interesting with the Bo Xilai saga because in some ways, if you've been outside of China, it's been like watching court TV if you're in the United States, or some really hard character drama that really enraptured a global audience, even if you weren't a China watcher or someone deeply into China. It's taken all of us in who watch China every day, and the saga still continues. We're waiting to see what's going to happen to Bo Xilai. So without further ado, maybe John will tell us what's going to happen. John?
Thank you, Tara. Thank you for having me today. Tara, my wife, and I, we've been sort of discussing a lot in the last 24 hours about whether we can cover Chinese politics from Hong Kong, because it does look pretty nice outside. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here. And in some ways, I reckon with this subject, we should almost begin with a minute's silence to the founding father of Chinese political journalism, Bo Xilai, because he really is the story that keeps on giving. All of us in the greater China journalism world have been following this one story in a way that I don't think we've ever followed the same stories, in 20 years, really. And it's the one time where I've really thought that, we as a community have really helped the understanding of China within China, really broken, collectively some really interesting new angles and developments in a way that I don't remember happening before, at least in my short career. I think that Bo Xilai was the guy who really made editors throughout the world think it is worth investing in serious political journalism in China, without these extraordinary events. And if you remember, I was actually sitting trying to write another book in a little office in Beijing when this stuff kept on breaking and all these crazy stories kept on appearing on Bo Xun. And, surely the China's most feared police chief hasn't defected or sought refuge in the US consulate, and it turned out it was true. And surely that he wasn't trying to detonate the career of China's most charismatic politician, and that one turned out to be true as well. Surely his wife, this politician's wife, didn't really kill an Englishman and by forcing cyanide down her throat. And as far as I can tell, that one turned out to be true as well. It really was the moment where I think Chinese politics became accessible to people all through the world. People in China were fascinated and are fascinated by it. He is an extraordinary character. There's so many dimensions to the story. The bit that I was always most personally interested in is this kind of remarkable, as well as this amalgam, this almost unique amalgam of money and power and politics that we see in China, but the family aspect of it, the dynastic thing, looking from Bo Yibo to Bo Xilai to Bo Guagua up on the photo there, and this is not the biggest family in China. This is maybe these guys would probably struggle to make the top 10. So this great dynastic, unresolved contest that's happening between the families in China today, and Bo Xilai blew all that open. And a large part of my book is really about sort of tracing back some of those contests, to the Cultural Revolution and even beforehand. Now, there's no relationship, I think, that is more interesting than the relationship between the Bo family and the Xi family. So here they all are, in happier days. There's Xi Zhongxun on the right, Bo Yibo in the middle, Peng Zhan on the left. Interestingly, Peng Zhan himself, not long after that, was accused of running an independent kingdom in Beijing. and this is an accusation that's frequently thrown at Bo Xilai. I did a quick Baidu search and something like 2.5 million hits for Independent Kingdom of Chongqing on Baidu at the moment. So these are long-running themes. These contests between the families have been going on for a long time, and really the first purge. I mean, this is what's going on now. It's one of the great purges of Communist Party history. But the first real purge of the PRC involved a lot of these guys. It was really Bo Yibo's direct patron, Liu Shaoqi, president at the time, versus Xi Zhongxun's direct patron, Gao Gang. And that was a case where Gao Gang thought he had Mao's blessing to take out Liu Shaoqi, and it backfired on him, and in the end it was Gao Gang that got purged, and he is the first, and that's the first and only time that a senior Chinese leader has committed suicide back in 1955. So Xi Zhongxun, the father of Xi Jinping, the PRC was only 5 years old when his whole political world was blown apart back then. He spent the next really 20 plus years in purgatory. That was Xi Jinping's founding formative years. He grew up with his father. He started his life with his father, was a great hero of the revolution, helped to co-found Yan'an. But from the time of about 2 years old, his father was in the fridge, and then from the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, he was in the deep freeze. And so it wasn't until after the Cultural Revolution that all these people sort of emerged again, and the elders started to appoint each other's children to important personal secretary jobs, and then they were all on the escalator, and the kids are often running on their own career path to see who could meet at the top, circa 2012, 2013. So that really is one of the important dynamics we're seeing in the unravelling of all this, is old grudges, old contests coming to a fore as the children take over the collective dynasty and they try to work out the new rules for a completely new political experiment, which China is, I think, at the moment. Talking about the Xi Jinping and the Bo contests, they were at the middle of, or they were at the edge of the first great clash in the mid-50s, and they were at the centre of the great ideological clash of modern China in 1987. So Xi Zhongxun, Xi Jinping's father, had been very close to Hu Yaobang, the great liberal reformer, party secretary of the 80s. They worked alongside each other, and when Hu Yaobang was purged, it was Bo Xilai's father, Bo Yibo, who was really the spear carrier. He chaired the 5-day, what they called the Democratic Party Life meeting. They loved euphemisms then, and they still do today. And so for 5 days, they accused Hu Yaobang, who had really opened China to the world, along with a whole bunch of them. A great hero of modern Chinese history was ridiculed, harassed, accused of all sorts of things for 5 days straight, led by Bo Yibo. And Xi Jinping's father was the only guy, the only of the elders. There were other lesser people who also spoke up, but Xi Zhongxun was the only guy who stood up for Hu Yaobang and defended him on grounds of process. Who are we, we retired elders, to override the Communist Party's own constitution and play and sack the party secretary, the party boss at the time? If we don't have law at the top, if we don't have process, then how can we expect to have any sort of functional society? Now, I think it's more than ironic that Xi Jinping, 25 years later, is sort of reaping the whirlwind. His father lost that battle in 1987, and as we all saw him on stage back on November the 15th, lined up with all these guys that have been appointed by these backstage kind of, the gerontocracy behind him. And so it's amazing how little things have changed, not least because Xi Jinping's father lost that battle in 1987, that a whole bunch of people who wanted to alter the system back then got sidelined in that epic 3 years from 87, culminating in Tiananmen in 1989. Families, dynasties. So this is the Xi dynasty. There's Xi Zhongxun down front middle. So after he lost that battle in 87, he no longer played a prominent role in government. He moved down to Shenzhen and lived out the rest of his life. It was a long life. He also, he was not mentally very well after 1989, 1990. We don't. It's all very kind of opaque history. We don't know the causation chain, but he no longer played a part in politics after 87. Retired completely after 89. So the person who held the family together was Qi Xin, his wife, the matriarch, down on the bottom left. She's still very much got her marbles, and she's the host for the Spring Festival gatherings. And I'm told, and I'm sure it's the case, that she very much remembers those ancient battles back in 1987 and probably beforehand. She would be very much enjoying the way some of these family battles are playing out today. There's Xi himself, top left, and even just within this family, this is one of the great families of the Reform movement. But just to illustrate how complicated their challenges are, if you just look at his siblings, some of those people in the top row there's Chow Chow on the top right, and as our friends at Bloomberg told us at the end of May last year, her daughter owns a $35 million apartment over here at Repulse Bay on the back of Hong Kong Island, as part of her extended portfolio. And as one close friend of the family told me, it's like, we can't really blame her because it was a wedding gift from her husband and she didn't want it, and so it's just laying there without any guests for the last 5 years. $35 million worth sitting at Repulse Bay if anybody needs a place to squat, I guess, for the weekends. Just showing how difficult it is to disentangle family from politics, and anyone who wants to move forward the cause of law in China, has got these extraordinarily complicated equations to deal with, including in their own homes. Again, dynastic family politics. Despite all that had gone on between their fathers, there was a moment of accommodation between Xi and Bo, and perhaps it was never better illustrated than this moment, which is literally days after Xi Jinping was appointed Vice Chair of the Central Military Commission, and that was the moment where almost only dynamite was going to kind of prevent him from turning up as party secretary at the Congress, which we saw in November. So, crucial appointment. The first thing he does is he flies down to Chongqing, spends 3 days in Chongqing, if you believe the Chongqing Daily, and there's plenty of friends of Xi Jinping who say we shouldn't, and Chongqing TV, and remembering Chinese TV has voiceovers, so you never actually quite hear what they actually say. But according to the voiceovers and according to the reports, Xi Jinping was saying all kinds of wonderful things about Bo Xilai's Chongqing experiment, including singing red brings joy to the people's hearts, smashing black does similar things. He was at that moment 100% behind the Bo Xilai experiment in Chongqing, according to the reports at the time, which incidentally got instantly deleted after Bo was sacked properly in April last year. So what was going on there? I think a couple of things were going on. There's people who, in that world of families, Bo Xilai's always had a lot of enemies, a lot of people who were suspicious. He's also had a lot of friends and a lot of allies in these shifting alliances. There are plenty of people who say that Xi always saw Bo Xilai as a threat. There was never going to be room for two tigers on top of this particular Communist Party mountain. And it suited him to a T to kind of accelerate the destruction of Bo Xilai since. But for a few years there, it really suited him, because what Bo did is he by harking back to the Mao era themes, he was also serving to highlight what their fathers, particularly, but also their mothers, were fighting for. These extraordinarily courageous fighters in Yan'an and in the Civil War and the Anti-Japanese War, exaggerated as well, but extraordinarily courageous people. They were fighting for ideas and ideology, and it presented in implicit contrast to what China has become, to the mere apparatchiks who have been running China since their father's generation sort of stepped back in the early 90s or late 80s. So this deep red princeling movement, Xi Jinping signed up to it along with several others. It suited him, and Bo Xilai was the main flag carrier for that. There's also patronage and factional reasons of convenience for them to have a close association. Bo Xilai's key patron and protector throughout was Jiang Zemin, and Jiang Zemin was, of course, the person who in the end signed off on Xi Jinping's elevation to the position of president in waiting back in 2007. So they shared a factional patron. They shared a common interest in the deep red princeling movement, going back to the Mao era families and ideals. But it was I suspect there was never much love between them. And the moment that Xi got the chance, it was possibly him shifting his weight in a divided standing committee that really brought the house down on Bo Xilai at the NPC in March last year. Now, how are we going for time? Yep, terrific. Okay, so this is what Xi Jinping says about Bo, now. What he was doing was no longer bringing joy to the people's hearts, but it was in fact despicable, and it shocked people. So this was the opportunity of a lifetime for Xi. It's going to provide, well, if all goes to plan, it provides Exhibit A. Well, Xi talked about catching tigers. I talked about there not being room for 2 tigers on the mountaintop. Well, he said he's going to catch tigers in his anti-corruption campaign. Bo will be a wonderful Exhibit A when it happens. And it also, if the purge of Bo proceeds to plan, it's a wonderful weapon. Every leader that's ever consolidated power properly in China has done so with the assistance of a couple of well-aimed purges, because he doesn't just get to go after and destroy one person, but he can potentially shift the parameters of debate, tell a new story. It's all about how you frame the purge of Bo, and particularly it taints dozens and dozens of people and families and powerful people who were connected to Bo. Now, the very reason that Xi wants to proceed with this purge, not even mentioning his own family background, his father must be just kind of dancing up there. That's also what makes it so difficult. And so there were these reports a month ago when several journalists went down to Guiyang because there were rumoured reports there'd be a trial of Bo down there. Look, I don't think it was ever that close to being a reality, because the party always puts a lot of emphasis, at least on the appearance of process, and so they couldn't have just held a trial in Guiyang without any notice. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't something in the works and it might have got cancelled. I'm told that since the Politburo signed off on his purge properly in October last year, and since Xi's elevation, suddenly there's a whole bunch of the families are greater stakeholders in the new system, the new administration, than they were before, and a lot of these people are intimately connected with Bo and his brother, particularly Bo Xicheng. They were brilliant at dispensing favours, joint ventures in Chongqing, back in Shanxi province, which we were talking about before, the coal mines in particular. You don't have to go back through very many PLA defence ministers to find a few who've got coal mines courtesy of Bo Xicheng. These sort of things are really difficult to unravel, and so the longer it goes on, also the longer people have to rally to potentially make things more difficult, to limit, quarantine, or even postpone the trial of Bo Xilai. So I suspect that Xi still has a major battle ahead of him if he really is going to put the political stake, so to speak, through Bo Xilai's heart, which I think politically he needs to do for all sorts of reasons, not least of which is Bo Xilai is an extraordinary character, and nobody would like to see him sort of out of the cage, so to speak. It'd be a very interesting and challenging experience for Xi Jinping. We talked a bit about the reformist roots of Xi Zhongxun, his who he was working for in the late 70s and the late 80s. Hu Yaobang looms ever larger, I think, in the reform story of China. People who are talking about, people who have aspirations about China developing a more reformist, accountable, rule of law kind of society. They do so increasingly by talking about what Hu Yaobang was doing and talking about 15, 20 years ago. It's always been the case. You talk about the future by talking about the past and redefining the past. So Hu Yaobang is extremely important. His son Hu Deping is close to Xi Jinping, as are several other people who have very different outlooks. And it's interesting to note here, I don't think you can ever forget that those three characters were very close, and Xi Jinping is very close. All of these guys, Hu Jintao, just to the right of Hu Yaobang, Wen Jiabao at the far right. I must say Hu Jintao looks a lot more relaxed and happier than he did on November the 8th, from memory. All of these guys have very deep-seated bonds. The kids, Xi Jinping, Wen Jiabao, Hu Jintao, they all go around to visit Hu Yaobang's widow each year, just west of Zhongnanhai at the family home. They're all close to Hu Zeping, and so in the world, the political world that Xi Jinping is dealing with, there is a strong kind of reformist voice in his ear from the legacy of Hu Yaobang, along with many other things who are competing for his attention and may be prevailing at the moment. I think I might wind it up there. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you're interested in. Now, a little quick, that's the little book. Now, all I can say in its favour is it's quite short, and so if you don't like it, it doesn't take too long out of an afternoon to get through it.
John, thanks very much. Let's open it up to questions and answers. We have plenty of time for discussion. So there's mics around the room, and David Schlesinger, do you want to start?
Thanks. Don, you alluded to this at the beginning, but it seems like the foreign media has played a very strong role internally in this case, much more than anything before. Is that just because of Neil Heywood? Is it because of social media, or is the foreign media actually being used by different sides?
It's a very interesting and valid question, right? So whenever a really interesting development would break in the Western media about Bo Xilai, the first question anybody asked was, are they being used by the party? Look, I actually think it was actually a bit more messy than that. The whole thing had been, it was an explosion at Party Central. There was nobody who had a tight control on the party narrative. I think that, but I would say that those very early Bo Xun leaks, they were very well informed and proved to be correct, extraordinarily so. At least in the first few days of the defection of attempted defection of Wang Lijun, the police chief, to the Chengdu consulate, U.S. consulate. So the reason this was no longer able to be contained, because it was contained in Chongqing, within the court, kind of the inner court, for 3 months. The reason it broke out was simply because the police chief went to Chengdu and told the Americans about it. Once it was out, it could no longer be contained like it used to. I think there were insiders in the Chinese system who were using Bo Xun. They do have channels to these overseas websites. In the very early days, a lot of them were very well informed. Social media played a huge role. The contrast between the last time such a more senior person was attempted to defect was probably Lin Biao in 1971. It took 12 months for Party Central's, first of all, to work out what its story was, sort of create the whole coup kind of narrative, and 12 months for it to be pushed down all the 24 levels of the Chinese bureaucracy and then to the public. The average peasant in China didn't know that Lin Biao was dead until 12 months later. In this, you suspect that hundreds of thousands of people who were kind of reading Weibo knew about this before Hu Jintao. It's a completely different environment where you can still shape the story, you can still filter information, you can guide people's opinion, but you can no longer just stop it like you used to. And I think we're in a completely different epoch, and the internet was part of it, commercial media was part of it, the internet was part of it, but Weibo has just taken it to a whole new, different realm. So were we being used? I don't think so. In fact, I'm say so with a lot of confidence. I'm not aware of any centrally directed leaks. But what did happen with this story is that Bo was a guy who was an incredibly divisive guy. He had a lot of friends and he had a lot of enemies. And this princeling world they operate in, these are people who believe they are entitled to expressing their opinions on something they care deeply about. So the battle is being played out in the social media and the foreign media and the over-Chinese media. If the people didn't talk to people like us, then they were giving up. And there's so much was at stake. People that hated Bo, people that loved him, people that hated what he stood for, loved what he stood for, who stood to be affected by his various sort of business or political dealings. Everybody had a stake in the story. So I think in my view, and you've got a right to be sceptical, is it was actually just a case of the system being more fragmented and porous and more cracks in it than at any time, probably since the post-Tiananmen moments.
Sort of just following on from David's question, though, now that came out in the open and it's out there, especially with this Bo story, is there any way that he and the party is going to be able to put the genie back into the bottle and control things again, or is that it? It's kind of now a different playing field for politics.
Look, I never underestimate the capabilities of these guys to control things. But the genie, I don't think the genie can ever put stuff back into the bottle. So can they ever have the monopoly on truth, basically, like they have so much over the last 70 years? Oh, I don't think they can. So there's a massive adjustment that needs to be taken, and maybe we're seeing signs of it too. The appearance of openness since we've seen since the rise of Xi Jinping is in no small part a reaction to this. Nobody in China could now argue with it, or corruption's only my local kind of official and doesn't go to the top. Now, it's out in the open. Everybody knows that. Now, they can be kind of sold a positive story again. They can get on board again, but I don't think the Chinese public will ever just swallow the official narrative in a way that it has before. So governing a one-party dictatorship just becomes much harder than it was.
Francis, and then we'll go back to the floor.
Francis Moriarty, RTHK. Lurking someplace in the back of my mind here is the whole question of June 4th, '89, and the party coming to some sort of final resolution on this, which people have called for. By that I mean people who call for saying this whole thing has to be dug out once and for all, and apologies, etc. That's behind the question. The question I want to ask is this just all about individual power and greed and maybe revenge, or is there some ideological component lurking in there somewhere?
Yeah, look, the first lengthy story I wrote about this was actually my editors at Foreign Policy put the headline on it, Wen Jiabao's Revenge. And I thought it was a terrific headline, but I think there is much more to the story. It is actually about, it is really about the future of China that this particular family feud is about. For the year leading up to that, some of the most courageous, extraordinary lawyers that I've ever had the pleasure to meet were meeting, agitating, and developing this narrative that what Bo Xilai was doing in Chongqing was taking China back to the Cultural Revolution. That was the Chongqing model, and Cultural Revolution defined as a system where there are no power is not confined. There's no constraints on elite power, and that was their working definition, which is quite different to I think how a lot of us had imagined or conceive of the Cultural Revolution. So Bo Xilai was already being played into Exhibit A in this great ideological debate about where China was going, led by the lawyers, with leaders of civil society drafted in, and some of the liberal families playing a very important role, particularly Hu Yaobang. And Wen Jiabao's language on March 15th, or maybe it was March 14th, when he foreshadowed the sacking of Bo Xilai, which took place the other day. He explicitly linked Bo Xilai's downfall to we don't want a repeat of the Cultural Revolution. So for Wen, it's much more than personal, although it is heavily personal as well. For Hu Yaobang's families and descendants, it's much more than personal. For some members of the Xi family, it's much more than personal. For every self-respecting lawyer in China, it's much more than personal. So I actually think that although there are some very vicious, extraordinary feuds kind of in the middle of this, it is actually about what vision of China people are fighting for. So I think it's much bigger than that. I think they're playing for the whole future of the country.
89?
So 89. Now what's the question in 89?
There are many people who would feel that China is not really going to be able to move forward unless at some point there is a determination on 1989, aside from the official verdict that was given, which is probably unacceptable to many people, certainly in Hong Kong. But somehow they need to grapple with that and put it behind if there's going to be some sort of unity of the Chinese people.
Look, I personally think that there's very unlikely to be any sort of meaningful and lasting political reform unless there's a much more honest look at history, and Tiananmen is the most difficult because it affects people who are still in power today. So I think that question is inextricably wrapped up with the question about where China is going. I don't think nobody's going to be brave enough to touch it, before that moment, if there is going to be such a reform moment in China. It's hard to imagine, for example, how anybody could tackle that question without having, while Jiang Zemin and Li Peng are still kind of, pulling strings behind the scene, and while Deng Pufeng is still a powerful figure in, unless somebody like Deng Pufeng actually leads the change of heart. So it's not going to happen soon. If there is any signs of a more honest look at Tiananmen, then I think that the whole parameters of where China's going are massively expanded, because history is such an important determinant of the future in China.
We have a question over here.
Peter Bozar, semi-retired advertising executive. With all his power, resources, and wealth, why did Bo Xilai need this guy Neil Hayward to begin with? Of all the accounts that I've read, it's still not clear, and I've read your book, and it seems like the question of large sums of money being transferred overseas is not even relevant anymore. And why would he even need him for that? I mean...
Why was Hayward necessary? Look, I suspect Bo kind of regrets that particular relationship, along with a couple of others. And, he was, in my assessment, and this is, things will change, we'll learn more as things go on. He was a bit player. He was a guy that had latched onto the one potentially lucrative relationship he had. He tried to make it pay. He was scared of it, but he couldn't bear to leave it. I think that, there's a couple of key factors here. One was that this police chief, Wang Lijun, he really was a piece of work, going right back to the beginning of their engagement by the family, quite possibly to investigate the suspected attempted murder of the wife, Gu Kailai. So Wang Lijun sort of straddled his way into the family. There are conspiracies within conspiracies from the time that he lands inside the inner court of Bo Xilai. We know that, I'm pretty well satisfied that Gu Kailai was a little bit bonkers towards the end, and that may actually be the most important factor in all of this. So you've got a conspiring, manipulative police chief. You've got a Bo Xilai's wife who's formidable and capable and very intelligent, but a bit bonkers. You've got an environment in Chongqing which is hermetically sealed. It's such a family-run enterprise that no information can come in or out. And in that kind of environment, the most remarkable kind of fantasies can sort of germinate and develop. And at some point, it seems that, I think with a lot of help from Wang Lijun, the police chief, Gu Kailai decided in some way that Hayward was threatening the family, probably by information that he knew rather than any kind of financial extortion. But nothing makes sense, and perhaps madness, as unsatisfying as it is for an author of a book about the episode, maybe that is the most important factor, that it was just a completely irrational act. He was a small player, and they could have ignored him.
Over here.
Toh Han-Shi from South China Morning Post. What do you think are the chances that supporters of Bo Xilai will take some kind of revenge on people like Wen Jiabao for putting him away, or even Xi Jinping in future?
Look, these are not small things, and so never until now has the party disciplined its own children, and so if and when Bo is put away, it really sets a precedent. How do you define his crimes? Surely it was just not because he funneled a few $1 million through business contacts to friends, because, well, we all do that. Was it the cover-up of a murder? That's probably, that's easier to differentiate from what we know about what the other people are doing in the Politburo. So can it bite them? Look, it probably already has made life much more difficult for Wen Jiabao. That and the combination of the New York Times story expose of his wealth has really helped hurt Wen Jiabao. There's no doubt about it. And it's also made the purge of Bo Xilai more difficult, because conversations we're starting to hear at pretty elite levels are, well, it's well and good, so Bo, he guofened, he overstepped the mark. But hang on, what's he got that Wen Jiabao hasn't? Why isn't Wen Jiabao on trial? Or maybe why isn't Bo on trial at all? So there's lots of people who may not have been personally affectionate for Bo, who feel a solidarity, a common collective interest in, or if he goes down, then they're all exposed. It sets a very dangerous precedent. I think Wen Jiabao's still fighting, by all accounts, to get his people onto the State Council, but he's substantially weakened, not least of which because of his the stand he took on Bo. Xi Jinping, look, I really think it's if he wins, he really wins. If he loses, he's vulnerable. Because Bo was just tapped into this extraordinary red network of power and money and family privilege. If she doesn't really destroy him, then he is exposed.
Time for one last question, Robin.
Robin Meredith. Do you have a sense, there was a lot of debate about whether Xi Jinping was a reformer. You presented his reformist history, and yet
When he what?
it was a reformer, an economic reformer.
As his father? Or?
Whether Xi
whether
Jinping
he
is,
yeah.
yeah, because it seemed that he played his cards very close to his vest, and there are kind of conflicting statements. On the one hand, cautioning about making the mistakes that the Soviet Union did recently. On the other hand, doing the whole Shenzhen tour, Southern tour, etc. So what's your bet?
Look, it's only a bet. Look, I think he's an economic reformer because he's got no choice. That the current model is reaching the end of its sustainable life. It needs to be adjusted, and he seems to me to be a reasonably courageous leader. So I suspect he'll turn out to be an economic reformer. On the politics, well, it's a battle between what some of his liberal friends and his family believe that he represents secretly inside his heart and what he actually says. There's very little on the record from what he's said that gives any hope that he's not advertising himself as a political reformer. Those comments on Gorbachev were, that's kind of, that's a pretty definitive answer. We're not going there. I'm not going to be China's Gorbachev. I'm going to be the tough guy. But then again, if he was secretly a reformer, like lots of people, his friends say he is, you probably would choose to go along the track he's going anyway, because you're not going to get anywhere until you've really consolidated power. So I don't have a strong judgment on where he's going to go with that. It wasn't going to happen straight away. He's got to do he's got a whole bunch of things to do first. One is consolidate power, which he's done remarkably quickly by the looks of things in the military, at least. He's got to consolidate power on the political side. He's got to allow Li Keqiang to do a whole bunch of things on the economic side to set things on a more sustainable course, and then you can deal with all these other much more difficult questions. So I'm afraid it's too early to tell.
And we'll leave it on that note. I guess the theme is to be continued. The drama goes on. John Garneau, thanks very much for coming today.
My pleasure.
And we do hope you'll come visit us more often at the FCC. I know you've been down to the bar maybe once in all your time here, so we'll give you a small gift from the club in hopes you'll come back.
Yeah, but I did have trouble walking out from the bar that time.
Thanks, everyone.